Welcome. We'll get started. For those looking for seats, there's some extra seats in the front 3 rows. Please feel free to take them. We have no course dinner today. There's a formal dinner going on in Leverett House, so the next one will be next Wednesday. And if I can have your attention. As I mentioned on the first day of the course, a Swedish sociologist, Hedda Eckervald, attempted to select the 3 most important voices on globalization questions. And judging from speeches and writings, she felt that the clear choice would be Noam Chomsky, Naomi Klein, and Arundhati Roy. It is a tremendous honor and pleasure to introduce Naomi Klein. And we are fortunate that this public intellectual superstar has flown in from Toronto on her way to Baghdad to speak with us. A former Miliband Fellow at the London School of Economics, Naomi Klein is the author of No Logo, taking aim at the brand bullies, which has sold more than 1 million copies and been translated into 27 languages, a truly global bestseller. We've read part of her most recent book, Fences and Windows, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Globalization Debate. Over the past year, she's made a documentary film about the economic travails in Argentina and workers' responses to them, and that film has just premiered in Canada and will be soon coming here. Naomi Klein's syndicated columns are published each week in more than 20 countries and are featured in Britain's The Guardian, Canada's Globe and Mail, and in the United States in The Nation. She has generously agreed to continue discussion with a smaller group of us after 4 for a few minutes. So we will break at 4 for those of you who have other obligations, and then have a continued discussion for those who are able to stay for a short time. Please join me in welcoming one of the most influential writers of our time, Naomi Klein.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that amazing introduction. Can you guys hear me okay? Good. Well, I'm thrilled to be here. And I'm so psyched that I don't actually have to make a speech. Although I will say that if there had been a course like this when I was in university, I might not have dropped out.
Many of us dream of following in your footsteps, and we're wondering...
Well, I am here to give career advice, right? So I thought I'd start with the basics.
Between that moment or even between before you dropped out and the time when you finished writing a book that would be eventually a global bestseller, what were you doing? What were the steps that led you to create No Logo? And were there some roots of that evident even in your own time in college?
Yeah, definitely. I was a student activist when I was at university. I went to the University of Toronto. I studied philosophy and literature. But I got really wrapped up in campus politics, which I know, as many of you know, happens. And I started writing for our university newspaper and ended up editing the university newspaper, which is actually a full-time job, which is why I failed to complete my degree. After I edited the student newspaper for a year, I got a student internship at a national newspaper in Canada called the Globe and Mail, which is our sort of New York Times. And and they kept me on. So it's really their fault that I didn't finish my degree. But at U of T, I think I was definitely an activist first, and I started writing for the campus newspaper because I wanted to share with the rest of the university community why I was an activist. And I was mostly involved in women's issues and anti-racism issues on campus. And so I started writing op-ed pieces. And I also come from a political family, so I kind of grew up with politics in the house. It came naturally to me. My mother was pretty active in the women's movement. So, yeah. And so I guess you could say in some ways I inherited my interest in politics. And then from working at a mainstream newspaper, I got really frustrated with the fact that they really weren't interested in covering that they weren't really interested in covering the issues that I cared about. So I ended up leaving and going to a small sort of progressive magazine in Canada and becoming editor of that magazine when I was about 23, 24. And I did that. And it was out of that work that I ended up deciding to write No Logo. It was out of the research. And I was already writing columns at this point. And I think that the decision to write a book was realizing that a lot of the research I was doing was connected and having a kind of a click moment where you realize that there's a larger thesis, and that there's a thread connecting things that you were looking at as sort of a distinct article, just a distinct topic. And that happened to me between the connection between my interest in over-marketing and the loss of public space and my interest in the denigration of labor conditions. So I had been writing about sweatshop conditions. This is, relating to No Logo. I don't know how many of you have read the book, but it talks about the connection between our experience of over-marketing and the loss of public space and the denigration of work and the rise of the sort of mick job and contract job, as well as the sweatshop job around the world, through the lens of corporate branding. And I'm not going to give you the whole, because I'm not supposed to be making a speech, but it was when I realized that these things were connected, that there was a corporate ideology connecting them, that I thought, okay, this is too big for an article. It's a book. So that's when I decided to write the book.
And now we have a question. Now we have a question from Erica Hammond.
Hi. My question has two parts. First is, how have you been able to instill a sense of urgency in other people who have been resigned to the issues surrounding globalization? And how can we as students, who may feel powerless and resigned so far away, become active and help the fenced-in people you have written about who have been negatively affected by globalization?
Well, when I wrote No Logo, which was in the late 90s, a lot of it was inspired by activism that was going on university campuses, including at Harvard, where there was, when I was in university in the early 90s, I left university in 93, the politics on our university campus had very little to do with sort of macroeconomic issues. Nobody talked about globalization. Nobody talked about the global economy. Very few people even talked about the economy. It was very much focused on identity and individual rights and group rights. But it was not, and when I think back on those years, what was going on, because those were actually the years where some very, very key global shifts were happening in terms of the creation of the World Trade Organization, loss of national power to international organizations. When I think about what was driving us in those years, I think a lot of it had to do with, there were these battles that were, called the political correctness wars on university campuses, which, we still hear that phrase thrown around. It's often used in very reactionary ways. But when I think about those years, I think that we were so ill-equipped to get our heads around something as huge as the global economy. We didn't learn about it at school. It was this sort of alphabet soup of acronyms that gave everybody perpetually this feeling that they were sick the day when everybody else learned what all the acronyms stood for. You were constantly, having that feeling of, okay, I missed that day. So we kept focusing more and more inwards on ourselves, on our university campus, on, our course syllabus, which is always important, but we somehow became so inward-looking that we almost couldn't see the outside world of our own city, let alone our country, let alone the world. And we became more and more parochial, I think, in our concerns. And that had to do with, frankly, I think, fear of actually confronting and a feeling that we actually didn't have the intellectual tools to confront these global economic forces, because you need the intellectual tools. And so what I found really exciting about the wave of activism that inspired me to write No Logo was that on campuses like this one, you started to see young people getting their heads around this incredibly daunting structure by using the iconography of the global market itself. So just grabbing a Nike running shoe and going, I'm going to use this shoe as a popular education tool. I'm going to follow the creation of this running shoe, where it was produced, how it was marketed to me, how it was sold at the mall, and I'm going to have this picture, this X-ray of the global economy in miniature, but yet it's going to be connected to me and my culture because this is a pop culture icon as well as a product. And you have, I think, I don't know if Cynthia Enloe has spoken here yet or is going to be speaking here, but she's somebody who has done this with clothing in her writing, using what is close to us, what we do care about, our culture, our school, what our school buys, and using that as entry points. And so I think that that's the answer to the question about how to bring a sense of urgency. And I think what's exciting, if you look at the rise of the student anti-sweatshop movement, how it evolved into going, okay, wait a minute, these labor injustices aren't just happening, in other countries, they're happening in our country, they're happening in our schools, and the living wage campaign that was so active here. So I think that starting with something that affects you, whether it's something that you buy, you wear, you consume, or it's people who serve you, who clean your rooms, who serve you food, who pick the tomatoes in, the fast food that you buy. We have all these personal connections, but not stopping there, using those essentially just as entry points. So I think that it's when people have an overwhelming feeling that the problem is so big, so colossal, that they may as well just stay home and watch TV, that you lose that sense of urgency. So you have to start small, you have to start personal, you have to start where you live. And I hope that answers both of those questions at once, in terms of what students can do and also how you can have that sense of urgency. I really think it's important, too, in terms of the urgency question, particularly in the United States. There's often, I think particularly at a school like Harvard, where there's so much privilege, that I think we sometimes mistakenly believe that guilt is your best motivator, right? That the way to get people active is to make them feel really bad, right? And kind of berate them with their complicity, in an abusive system. And that complicity is there, and the abuses are there. But my experience is that guilt is a short-term motivator. You make people feel guilty, and they might, give money, or do something little, but generally then they just try to avoid the people making them feel guilty, because people don't like to feel guilty. And I think I mean, we do need to understand our complicity. I'm going to, as Brian mentioned, I am going to Iraq in a couple of days, and and the idea behind that trip is very clearly to try to shine a light on what the occupying powers in Iraq are doing and all of our complicity in that. But at the same time, I think it's really important that when we talk about things like overconsumption and the role of the U.S. in the world, that we also look at the promises of this lifestyle and whether it's actually making us happy. And this is one of the things that Arundhati Roy does really well. Has anyone here ever seen Arundhati Roy speak? If she comes here again, you should really try to see her speak, because I think sometimes people expect that she's just going to berate them, you know, and make people feel bad about you know, America's role in the world and American overconsumption. What she actually does is ask people whether this American way of life that is supposed to be so sacred that your government, you know, wages war around the world to protect it, whether it's actually making you happy, whether it is, you know, and Arundhati describes the American way of life as the right to live alone in your house with your washing machine, which is a little extreme. But you know, I had this feeling once at an American campus right after I was living in Argentina for a year, researching the economic crisis. I went straight from Buenos Aires to a university in Colorado that shall remain nameless. And this young woman stood up. It was the first question I got. She said, "I understand what you're saying, and I realize," you know, I was talking about the effect of Washington, the so-called Washington consensus, neoliberal economic policies on Argentina. And she said, "I understand what you're saying, and I know it's really, really bad, but the problem is we don't really care." And she said, because, you know, we're comfortable. You know, I have my car. You know, I drive to Walmart. I drive to McDonald's. I drive to school. You know, I'm happy. You know, and so why should we care? Now, there's lots of ways that you can sort of deconstruct that whole exchange, but what really struck me was that what she was describing of driving to Walmart and driving to McDonald's and driving to school and, you know, kind of living from strip mall to strip mall actually didn't sound like that much fun. And a lot of what we keep being told is like this wonderful way of life that we have to protect is sometimes pretty bleak and lonely, which is why there's so many people on Prozac and other antidepressants. So I think that has to be part of the discussion too.
Andrea LaRocca.
Thank you for coming. Your articles are obviously very opinionated and offer a particular view of politics. What do you believe your role as a journalist is and should be in forming society's opinion about politics? And do you think there is and should be a moral activist aspect to journalist coverage?
Well, I consider myself an activist journalist, and I see, you know, I identify myself primarily as an activist, as someone who is driven by their desire for social change. But I happen to actually not like crowds very much. I think there's a lot of different ways of being an activist, and we have this idea in our head that activist equals march in a rally, hold a placard, scream into a megaphone. That's an activist. You can be an activist in any profession that you choose. You can be, you know, you can be an activist doctor, you can, you know, be an activist lawyer, you can be an activist entrepreneur, and you can be an activist journalist. It means that you use your skills and what you're good at, you know, in the service of social change. That doesn't mean that you never go to a protest. I mean, I certainly go to protests and rallies. I'm not a very good chanter, but I don't see those things in conflict. I think that if you're like a reporter at a newspaper and you're just, you know, on the beat, which is not what I do. I'm a columnist, which means that my role is to have opinions and to analyze. from a certain perspective. There are people whose job is to be a straight-ahead reporter, and those people whose job that is, I think have to be much more guided by the rules of balance. I don't use the word objectivity because I don't believe that anyone is objective, but I think that absolutely you must be fair and you must be balanced. And you must not be a propagandist as well. I mean, I think that you can be a journalist out of your desire for social justice, but also refuse to be a propagandist in the sense of distorting reality for those political ends, because I don't actually think that that serves those ends. But you know, the real activist journalists are working at Fox, right? I mean, not The Nation. We're timid at The Nation. At Fox, they're just, you know, gloves off. They're campaigning, crusading journalists for their particular worldview.
Alison Keevy.
Thank you for joining us. In your preface to Fences and Windows, you speak of the recurring theme of fences acting as barriers to resources, demonstrations, political policies, and other means of effecting change. When have you personally felt the burden of such a fence blocking you from implementing change, and how did you respond to this?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I wrote that, for those of you who read that essay, that it was highlighting the fact that we are seeing this explosion of fences and barriers at our borders, the explosion of the prison population, you know, the explosion of the private security industries. In many countries, these are the only places to get a job, is, you know, as a prison guard or as a private security guard, protecting the haves from the have-nots. I mean, this is part of accepting, as so many of us have, accepting the reality of a widening gap between rich and poor. It also means that the rich have to be protected from the rage of the poor, or from the mobility of the poor, from the needs of the poor. So whether that is at the border increasingly regulating immigration, or it's just in the neighborhood with, you know, ever more elaborate alarm systems, you know, in cities like Sao Paulo or New Delhi, where you have these, you know, very sharp divisions, or Boston for that matter. So that was why I used that metaphor. In terms of whether I personally have been affected, I think that it's part of that story that people like me really aren't that affected, or people like you, that we can kind of sail through life with this illusion, you know, that I just sailed through the border this morning. I'm going to, you know, sail through the border, you know, going to Jordan and then Iraq, and, you know, I will be under the impression, if I just want to keep my blinders on, that globalization is real, that we really can, you know, that we can enjoy this incredible mobility that technology affords us, and not see what an incredible privilege that mobility is, and what a huge majority of the world's population are shut out and face fences and barriers, where we are facing open borders and possibilities. So I would say, you know, beyond the barriers that I choose to face, you know, if I go to a summit, like the last one I was at was in Miami for the FTAA summit. I mean, certainly we were fenced in, but that was also a privilege. I mean, it's a privilege to choose to confront those barriers. And one of the things that was interesting about the FTAA summit in Miami was that there was really steady police harassment in the months leading up to it, telling the people who are sort of most affected by these policies in Florida, who are Latino workers, that if they went to these protests, they would be arrested and deported. So even just who can go to a demonstration in this country is increasingly being regulated, because you know, if your status is in any way vulnerable, these preemptive arrests that we're seeing at protests, or, you know, you left the protest pen, so people are just scooped up without doing anything, you know, that might mean, you know, an arrest record for some of you, or probably you won't even get that. But for, you know, but it would mean a deportation for somebody in a more less secure position.
Anthony Lascalzo will read the next question on behalf of a student.
Thank you, Naomi. You've written extensively about how America is essentially colonizing Iraq. How can we, as college students, make decisions that will affect the nation's economic policies both in Iraq and elsewhere? And since the government seems uninterested in the protest of the left wing, what can we do to be more effective?
Well, I don't actually think we've tried yet, to be perfectly honest. I think that there were some amazing protests against the war before it started. I mean, there was February 15th, where there were 10 million people around the world taking to the streets. But I would argue that most of what the left, or liberals in the States and in the UK as well, what we've been focusing on primarily has actually just been refighting the fight. You know, trying to prove ourselves right. You know, they really didn't have the weapons. Bush lied. Just kind of saying, you know, we were right, you were wrong. Which, you know what? We were right. But the idea of gloating about that, you know, after 550 American soldiers and more than 10,000 Iraqis have died, is just obscene. And the war is on. The war is ongoing. And the spoils of war continue to be divided at an alarming rate, with alarming speed. And, you know, at this point, the crime that was this war, and I believe that it was a crime, it pays, right? The moral of the story is crime pays. If you're Halliburton, it pays really well. If you're Bechtel, it pays very, very well. So in terms of, you know, what I think the opponents of this war should be concentrating on, is a couple of things. One, somehow finding strategic ways to make crime not pay. And I agree with Arundhati that there needs to be campaigns that really target companies that are profiting directly, and it's really easy to find out who those companies are. And I'm sure plenty of them have ties with Harvard. And you know, I was at Duke a little while ago, and at Duke it was a really interesting case because the company that got a contract worth $500 million, the largest contract of its kind ever awarded, is actually a company that one of these private research companies that was spun off from Duke. It's from Duke and University of North Carolina and North Carolina State University. It's called the Research Triangle Institute, and they were awarded the contract to set up Iraq's local government. Okay, this was given to a North Carolina firm, and I interviewed the vice president of this company who was in charge of the Iraq project, who admitted to me that nobody at his company had been to Iraq, and that they applied for the contract before the war even started. Okay, and USAID approached 3 firms and said, you can all bid on this contract that's going to be worth $500 million. And 2 of them refused to bid because they had problems with the idea of bringing democracy to a country that was about to be invaded. Also, that they were going to be working directly for an occupying power, which is sort of new territory for nonprofit research institutes, for NGOs, but that's what's happening. So I think it's really about following the money. And I think it's, you know, it comes back to the question that came up before about, you know, what students can do. You know, we've seen this. We've seen students, you know, find their way into making a real difference on labor abuses in other parts of the world, on your own campuses, by making these types of connections, by following the money. And I think that that's what needs to happen with Iraq. And I have a feeling that if you guys did some digging here, you would find some very, very interesting things. You know, if you go on the USAID website, you will get the list of all the contracts, and you know, there is some degree of transparency. And it is a terrible shame that billions upon billions of dollars that have been of U.S. taxpayer money that was awarded by Congress in the name of rebuilding a war-torn country is actually staying, for the most part, in the United States and lining people's pockets here in the face of an incredible humanitarian crisis. So, the idea that these research institutions are sort of happily taking contracts that have a built-in profit in them. All the contracts have they're called cost plus. So their costs are covered plus a guaranteed profit of anywhere between 3 and 7%. In a situation where you have, that money is money that's not going to buy drugs in Iraq, that is not going to hospitals, that's not going to fix the water supply. So that's what I mean by following the money, and I think it can happen.
Caitlin Ferreter.
In the preface to Fences and Windows, you describe how the anti-globalization movement was, in many ways, the moral stepchild of globalization. In other words, the same connections fostered by globalization also led to a transfer of information between people in various parts of the world who were opposed to and being oppressed by globalization. As an outgrowth of globalization itself, which you describe as perpetuating and emphasizing unequal distributions in wealth and power, to what extent does the anti-globalization campaign reproduce the same imbalances of power and distribution of resources inherent in the globalization movement? To what extent is the campaign dominated by Western voices? And finally, as a journalist, how do you try to incorporate the voices of people in regions of the world who are at the other end of the wealth, power, and privilege spectrum?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot in that question. That's a great question. In some ways, I would disagree with the premise, in the sense that, I do say in the foreword to the book that actually calling it an anti-globalization movement is a misnomer, and that mostly came out of the media. And what this movement, the movement that we're talking about, what it was actually, I think that there are some people who are against globalization. They're against technology, kind of Luddites. They think that we should all sort of stay home and grow our own food, and those people exist. I think that they are a very small minority, and within what is called the anti-globalization movement. And what the vast majority of people I know who became galvanized around these issues were driven by was they were reacting to the rise of corporate power, and that is global. And in most parts of the world, and this is also it applies to the question, because in the South, nobody uses terms like anti-globalization to describe these movements. In Latin America, for instance, they are anti-capitalist or they are reacting to neoliberalism, anti-neoliberal movements. So if you think about the fact that Latin America for the past 5 years has rejected these policies in many different ways, stopping privatizations everywhere from Bolivia to Mexico, kicking out neoliberal presidents in Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, Brazil. They are not saying we don't want to be part of the global economy. They're saying that we are rejecting a set of economic policies that we call neoliberalism. And those policies are privatization, deregulation, and downsizing. Call it kind of mixed government. The reason why it's globalization is because these policies are global, and they are globally enforced by international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank in a kind of one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter model. The most famous example of this was when the IMF went into Russia. There was, I think it was a journalist at the Village Voice, got a copy of one of their structural adjustment documents where they talked about how Russia had to privatize all of their state enterprises and eliminate all export tariffs. And they had done, and in the middle of the document they're reading, and instead of where it should say Russia, it says South Korea, okay? Because they did some kind of search and replace, but missed a couple, okay? So when I say it's actually, it's mid-government, it's one size fits all, it is literally the same recipe taken from South Korea and imposed on Russia, and now imposed in Iraq with even greater speed, but the exact same policies. These policies are called shock therapy. That's what they called it in the Soviet Union, in the former Soviet Union. That's what they're calling it in Iraq, but it's shock therapy imposed through shock and awe military force. Don't ask, just take. Call it bomb before you buy. So I think it's actually a willful act to refuse to call that anti-globalization instead of what it actually is, which is a rejection of neoliberalism, a rejection of what the French call savage capitalism. It's a response to global economic policies. It is not globalization. It is not the fact of being global that is the problem. It's the policies that are the problem. And the fact that they are globally enforced and that we're all dealing with them to one degree or other. You're dealing with a less dramatic drive towards of these same policies. But everybody's having these same policies enforced. In Canada, we're dealing with a great amount of pressure to privatize our healthcare system, our education system. That's what created the opportunity for a global movement. Because people were experiencing the same policies, they started to get together and not just respond with nationalist solutions and nationalist dogma. And so you started to see forums like the World Social Forum in Brazil, where people come together and talk about international strategies, cross-border strategies to respond to these global policies. So of course we have to be global because they're global, but I don't see that as an irony. In terms of how the globalization movement reproduces I would say that the globalization movement reproduces biases that are already inherent in our cultures, the racial biases, financial biases, and some of that is shifting. I think that the World Social Forum, the biggest example of that was the narrative that this movement started in Seattle, right? The story told was that this movement was born November 1999 in the streets of Seattle, which overlooked the fact that there had been huge demonstrations of tens of thousands of people in Malaysia, in the Philippines, in India, responding to the exact same policies, or the Zapatista uprising, which on January 1st, 1994, which was the day that NAFTA became law. So very clearly a response to these same policies. So that's just one example. But yeah, the fact that the World Social Forum, which is the largest gathering of this thing that people call the anti-globalization movement, the fact that its first 3 meetings happened in Brazil and its 4th happened in India, I think has been a part of a concerted effort to fix some of that.
Alicia Menendez.
Hi. Do you think that your status as a Canadian citizen has allowed you to take a more objective view in evaluating the role of the American government abroad? And as a follow-up and a personal challenge, this is going to be tough, I'm going to warn you, try to say something nice about President Bush.
That being a Canadian helps to see what the U.S. is doing, on the world stage so much. But I do think it does help culturally, because there's this very strange thing about Canada. Are you Canadian? Are there any Canadians in the room? I think Canadians are good watchers. We're good watchers. We are. We like to watch. That has to do with the phenomenon of we live next to the largest and most powerful country in the world, largest undefended border, getting more defended by the day. And we see you, but you can't see us, right? It's this really weird thing. And so I think that in terms of making us, more acute observers, and whether that's translated into comedy, satire, there's lots of great Canadian comedians or media critics like Marshall McLuhan, that experience of of being so, being inundated, seeing everything that's going on, but yet not being part of it, because of course you can't see us. We are next to the largest one-way mirror in the world. I think does create it's good for critics. We're a nation of critics. I don't know if that's good or not. I think that it's an interesting moment in Canada, though, because since September 11th, there has been, all the polls are showing that there's a greater gap between the way Canadians see themselves and the way they see Americans, whereas before there was a sense of, that continental integration, single currency, things like that, were kind of inevitable, that the border was sort of a technicality, that there really wasn't much of a difference. We have the same culture, the same language, what's the difference? That has really changed in the past 3 years because of the rise of, I think, of militarism and nationalism in the U.S., which Canadians just can't really relate to. So it's not so much that we've changed, but I would say that you've changed, and we don't relate to you as much anymore as we did before, it makes for an interesting time in Canada, because it's a challenge to us to say, okay, if we're not that, what are we? And we haven't answered that yet. And I would say, as far as a nice thing about Bush goes, I was trying to stall to think of one. He likes pretzels. I don't know. I like pretzels are good. Maybe a little too much.
Andy Latinsky.
Thank you. This is a fair and balanced question from the right. You said earlier in your speech that when referring to the Iraq War, as if the 550 soldiers had just died for nothing, and as if this entire war was a mistake, in your words. And I'm just wondering, when you say that there's a humanitarian disaster there, do you not see the linkage between doing something about it, which the United States and George Bush did, and not doing anything about it, and this wait-and-see approach that leads to terrorism in September 11th? So my question to you is, if you want to solve these humanitarian problems, how are you going to do that without taking action?
Okay. That's a really big question. And, I am an internationalist, and I do believe that there are moments when international intervention is necessary. I think that the terms when we go in should be very clear and should abide by international law. I think that one thing I keep thinking about, I'll come back to that humanitarian crisis in Iraq and who, certainly much of it was caused by Saddam Hussein, much of it was caused by the sanctions, much of it is caused, in terms of the illnesses, the biggest crisis in Iraq stems from, two things. One, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, the willful targeting of civilian infrastructure, particularly water treatment plants in the first Gulf War, which were never fixed, which internal Army documents talk about as a means to accelerate the effect of sanctions. That's the term used, which is that you target the civilian infrastructure, you target the water treatment plants, which means that you're going to be spreading diseases like cholera at a very rapid pace, which will weaken the country's ability to withstand sanctions, including withholding medicines. Okay, so this is an incredibly brutal policy, and it was the brutality of Saddam Hussein that allowed him to withstand it and just say, well, I don't care if all of those kids die, I'll let them die. But there were two parties in this, but the victims were the Iraqis, but in terms of when you go in and overthrow a dictator, because there are moments when you go in and overthrow a dictator, those moments have to be regulated. And I believe that the way the U.S. went in, all the evidence shows that they went in absolutely at the wrong time, and that your government was in no way ready for the transformation. and in terms of what's going on right now, where the country is potentially descending into civil war, it's looking more and more like that. And the talk now is, is it too soon for democracy to take root, and so on. So I want to leave that for a moment, and then I want to look at a country like Burma, which is also ruled by a brutal military junta. And the U.S. continues to do business. U.S. companies like Unicol are in there. There was a moment in Burma where you had democratic elections. You had a clearly chosen, democratically elected leader who was overthrown, who was blocked by a brutal military junta, and nothing was done. So in a moment, and it's ongoing, and she goes in and out of house arrest, prison, and so on. So there's a moment where you have a population that has taken all the steps, had the election, chosen their leader, and the world does nothing, right? If you intervene at that point, right, the country is absolutely ready for democracy because they've already had it. They've already fought for it. That's when you intervene. And what's actually happening now is the readiness of a country has absolutely nothing to do with when the intervention is happening. So nothing happens for Burma, which does all the work for democracy and actually needs the strength of the international community to come in and defend their democracy. In Iraq, they go in the name of democracy. But, I mean, what is going on in Iraq has absolutely nothing to do with democracy. I can prove that to you right now, if you'd like. What Paul Bremer did when he first arrived was he imposed the economic model that I talked about earlier at a speed that's never been seen before. He introduced a law on September 19th called Order 39. Order 39 allowed for, basically what Order 39 did is it erased Iraq's old constitution, which had laws protecting the Iraqi economy, regulating how much control international companies could come in and own of the economy. We have these rules in Canada, protecting our industry and so on. You have these rules here. Order 39 said that international companies, U.S. companies, can come to Iraq and have 100% foreign ownership of everything but oil and natural resources, because they were too afraid to do that right away. Order 40 did the same thing with the banking sector. They said there can be 100% foreign ownership of the banks. They also said that they also changed the entire tax structure, where the highest income bracket and the corporate tax rate was at 40%, which is actually the same as it is in Canada. They changed it to a flat tax of 15%. They also eliminated all the controls on foreign imports. So we're talking. The Financial Times called this a wish list for foreign investors. So they absolutely remade the country, and now we're having this battle right now about whether there's going to be a transitional government in Iraq and what the powers of that government will be. Well, on Monday, they passed the interim constitution. And there's a line in the interim constitution, an article in the interim constitution, that says that the interim government cannot change or amend any law that has been passed by the Coalition Provisional Authority. So all of these laws that were pushed through by Paul Bremer for the Bush administration are locked in, must stay in place until Iraq has elections, which right now is going to be in 2006. So by the time Iraqis get the vote, get their democracy, their country will already be sold off. There won't be anything left. This is what they're calling democracy in Iraq. So I think we just have different definitions of democracy.
Before we thank our guest, let me mention that for those who can stay, we will be continuing in a smaller discussion here up front. Naomi Klein, for your eloquent labor in the service of a more humane world, we thank you.